Hello and good afternoon. We have another segment of National History Day in Arizona. Today we are going to have an expert historian presenting on some paper basics. We know that we've had some fabulous papers in the past that have done well at nationals. And today I'd like to introduce or reintroduce to some of you Miss Janie Adams, who is a historian here for the Arizona Historical Society. And she will be sharing some paper basics. She has been a longtime judge, an NHD expert, and she is here to help better prepare you as you start your journey on your Turning Points in History project.
Thanks, Kristen. So, I'm moving through my presentation too quickly, but I'm actually speaking to you today as not only a historian, but also as the associate editor of the Journal of Arizona History. So I've seen a lot of history manuscripts and written a lot of history manuscripts. So I have some advice, kind of writer to writer, historian to historian, on what makes a really exemplary written history project. So a couple of top notes before we get started. A reminder that History Day has an annual theme, and so the point of the theme is to kind of explore all the different facets of history and think about ways that how what you're interested in kind of fits into a larger historiographical conversation. So it's your responsibility as the participating National History Day student to pick a topic that relates to the theme and write a good argumentative project that really defends how it connects to the theme, why it connects to the theme, and how it's important. So the theme is, of course, intentionally broad, and this can be very frustrating when we're trying to pick our topic, but the theme is very intentionally broad to give you the freedom to take the direction that you want to take. As when you become a professional historian later on in your adulthood, you will have the opportunity to research whatever you like. So this is an opportunity to see what that looks like and really get a sense of what you're interested in and how you can talk about it historically speaking. So some questions to keep in mind if you're still kind of batting around some project ideas is to really think about what is a turning point. And what really comes to mind when you think about turning points? Sometimes the most obvious answer is of course going to be the most interesting one, but sometimes you have to really think through it and kind of connect your personal interests to what you would like to research. So really spend some time with thinking about what is a turning point, how is it a turning point, why should we continue to care today, 50 years later, 150 years later, 1,000 years later, depending on the topic of your project. So reminder to pick something that you're passionate about to match the theme. How is my topic a turning point in history? A reminder to talk about historical significance. Why is my topic important? Why does it matter? A reminder to be specific about what you want to talk about, but also not so specific that you can't actually find any research material. So it's a fine line. It's a delicate balance between being too narrow and too broad. And of course, don't be afraid to ask for help. You can always email us at nhdaz@azhs.gov. We can also connect you to our reference librarians here at the Historical Society. You can talk to a librarian at your school, at your local library. A librarian is going to be a key player in your research project, I promise. And then some important dates to remember. So the regional contests are coming up soon. Students are going to be allowed to start registering for their contest starting January 1st, and you can see all of the different contest dates here. When you register for your contest, there will be some really important stepped dates. A reminder that your project materials for some of the categories are going to be due well in advance of the actual contest date. So make sure you put all of the important dates in your planner or in your calendar or in your iCalendar, whatever you use to stay organized. And then don't forget that the state contest will be April 13th. And then more important dates to consider, of course, are the rest of the workshop series. If you need to register for a workshop coming up, you can scan this QR code here on the document. It will take you to a spreadsheet that has all of the different registration links. Just go ahead and register for the one that you need. And then, of course, they will be recorded, and the recordings will be available later on the Arizona Historical Society YouTube channel. Okay, now that all of that is done, why should you write a historical paper? So picking your category is really, really important. And picking your category is almost as important as picking your topic. I know in my time with History Day, I've seen some really interesting topics, but they made a poor category choice. And because a poor category choice was made, you didn't actually convey your topic to its fullest potential. So a reminder that some categories are better suited for some ideas than others. So if you need a lot of images to make your point, maybe a paper is not the best choice. Maybe you want to go with something like an exhibit or a website or a documentary. But if your topic doesn't have a lot of images to pull from, it's on ancient cultures, it just doesn't have a lot of striking images that require analysis, maybe an exhibit is not the best choice, right? So really thinking about what materials are speaking to me as I'm doing my research, and how does that actually help me tell the story that I want to tell? So here's a really good example. So this is a thesis statement I've used many, 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 many times. So it says here, Chicano music communicated the needs of Chicanx people by using catchy, danceable music to share with a national audience the political, economic, and social struggles of La Raza. When I wrote this, I was fascinated by Lalo Guerrero, who is a Tucson hometown hero and the father of Chicano protest movement music in the 60s and 70s. So if I want to focus my paper on the sonic quality of his music, maybe a paper is not a good idea, right? Because I really can't capture the sound in a paper as well as I could in something like a documentary. But if I want to focus on the lyrical content of the music, I want to focus on the written words of the music, a paper would be a good choice. An exhibit is, of course, an interesting way to blend the two, but you really need to be aware of your multimedia time limits as far as the rules go for exhibits. So you also have to balance the rules in your equation there too. All right, so papers, manuscripts, theses, dissertations, monographs, articles, all of these different written texts are at the core of historical thinking and at the core of historical communication. Historians read and historians write. My first semester of grad school, I read, no joke, 100 books. Historians read a lot and historians write a lot. So reading and writing is always going to be core at what historians do. So writing creative nonfiction, which is what you're doing here when you're writing a historical paper, a historical monograph, is both an art and a science. You can communicate a lot of information and a lot of analysis, but you can still have fun and be a creative storyteller in addition to being the expert historian. So finding creative and exciting ways to communicate information, even in an essay, is really important. So here are some of the rules. As a reminder, please consult your National History Day rulebook for details, what ifs, FAQs. That is really going to be where you are going to find most of your resources as far as what font should I use? How should my cover page, my title page be organized? Make sure you consult the rulebook. So a paper is between 1,500 and 2,500 words. This word count, of course, does not include the title page, the process paper, your annotated bibliography, your citations or your footnotes, and then your primary sources in your appendices. Again, make sure you read the rule book, not only for proper formatting guidelines, but to make sure that your project is in the correct order. Your project must be in the correct order. And these kind of fiddly details are going to matter more and more as you move up through the contest process. So we might give you a pass at regionals if, maybe your paper isn't formatted correctly, but that absolutely will not fly at state. And that super will not fly at the national contest. And then finally, really important, papers are a solo endeavor. You cannot write a group paper. If you want to do a group project, you need to pick a different contest category. And not only are they a solo endeavor, all your ideas must be your own original ideas. And we can talk a little bit more about what that means later on in the presentation. All right, so your paper is going to be guided by a thesis statement. All of your History Day projects are going to be guided by a thesis statement, but I think the paper is really kind of the clearest place where you need to point and say, this is my thesis statement, this is what I am going to argue. So as a reminder, your History Day project is an argument. It's not a report. And I have heard over the years, oh, I don't want to argue. I don't want to, come off as aggressive. And that totally has to do with different definitions of the same word, right? A historical argument is like a legal argument, right? We're not yelling at each other. We are organizing evidence to make a point. So your project needs to have a thesis statement that not only guides it, but that is arguable and makes a point, right? You can't just assert an opinion because an opinion is not arguable. So it's really kind of balancing opinion and evidence. So every thesis statement on the planet in the whole wide world boils down to this formula. Thing is thing because XYZ. So the things are going to be nouns, ideas, concepts. There are lots of historical concepts that might come up during your research. Is a placeholder for a verb. When I'm drafting my thesis statement, I like to use whatever verb exists in the national theme for that year. So turning points is kind of weird because there's not really a good verb there, but I think you can puzzle through it. Because, of course, lets the reader know that you have evidence to back up your claim. And then XYZ are all the different reasons that the relationship between the two things is true, and it's a roadmap showing how you're going to prove your point. Of course, the thesis statement that you write when you begin your research is not necessarily the thesis statement you have when you submit your project for your regional contest. Not only do you need to be open to revising your thesis statement, right? It's not bad if your first thesis doesn't work after you've done some research. It's a necessary step in the process. You won't know everything that there is to know when you start researching. And as you're uncovering materials, you might find that you are more interested in one direction over another. So here's an example of that revision process. So I'm going to write about the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s, and I want to look at political differences between the states. And so I go down to the Arizona Historical Society reading room and I ask for materials about the Equal Rights Amendment. And as I'm kind of leafing through these materials, I'm finding that I can't really make a compelling argument about differences between states because there is a multitude of different opinions occurring at this time, and I just can't make a clear, concise argument about those differences between states. But what I am finding is information about women's liberation, educational opportunities, and potential military service for women. I'm looking at statistics about marriage and birth rates in the United States, and that's making me think that maybe I need to change my thesis statement. So perhaps a revision of my thesis statement could be something like, the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment showed American anxieties about changing gender roles in the United States. And here is all of my evidence that I have to support that argument. So history is a social science. Social sciences are tied up in the scientific method. And if we know our scientific method, we know that part of that method is to hypothesize, test, and then pending the results of that test, rehypothesize and retest. Ah, yes, citations. Citations, we love them, we hate them. They seem unnecessarily fiddly, but they're very, very, very important. And they're very, very important because, one, you're giving credit where credit is due. We had talked a little bit about making sure that the work is original. And so you are going to cite other experts in the field, But at the same time, you are asserting your own expert opinion because now you've read their work and you can analyze it and synthesize it and make a point that relates to your thesis using their work. And number two, the second reason why citations are so important is because you're leaving a roadmap of your thought process for future scholars to follow. So if I'm reading your project and you have this statistic that you cite and it just blows my mind and I can't believe it, I might want to double check that, not because I'm trying to play gotcha, but because I want to know more, because I want to know why these numbers were reported this way. And this is something called historiography, and historiography is vital to the profession. Historiography is the history of history writing, and it explores the way in which history and the historical narrative has changed based on changing values, changing technology, changing cultures, right? Historiography is super, super important. Okay, so things that need to be cited include, but are not limited to, direct quotes, and that includes summary and paraphrasing, ideas, figures, and diagrams, and all ideas that are not yours. And when you are in doubt, please cite your source. So speaking about direct quotes, summaries, and paraphrasing, a couple years ago at the national level, folks at History Day were actually having a conversation about disallowing students to use direct quotes because students used so many direct quotes to eat up the word count that we weren't actually getting any analysis. And at the time, coordinators persuaded the folks at the national level that maybe that was too far of a move. But it does bring up a really interesting and important point. And I always advise students that you should really only use a direct quote if it is absolutely imperative to your argument, if you absolutely need all of those words in that order to make your point, or if you couldn't have said it better yourself. Vast majority of the time, you should be summarizing and you should be paraphrasing. Summarizing and paraphrasing proves to the reader that you know, not only do you understand what the primary source is telling you, you can explain it in a way that furthers your thesis statement. So summarizing, paraphrasing is not lazy. It's actually a very important part of the historical process, but those summaries and paraphrasing do still need to be cited as if it were a direct quote. All right, citation styles. National History Day allows for the use of either, not both, not neither, Chicago style or MLA. So we'll start with Chicago style because Chicago style is the preferred style of professional historians. And I know more about Chicago style than I do MLA. And so here's an example of Chicago style. Chicago style uses the superscript footnote method. The only qualm that I have about this example that I shared is it shows this comma with a superscript 7 and then moves on to have period superscript 8. I would not advise you to put a note in the middle of the sentence. I would advise you to wait till the end to put your note, but I am not hip to the newest version of Chicago style, so perhaps that is permissible now. Double check your style guide. Always double check your style guide. So these footnotes, which you will please allow your computer to format for you. Don't try to format them yourself. Use your word processor to format your footnotes for you. You'll notice that there is a full note, which has all of the citation information, the full title of the journal article, the title of the journal, the volume, the number, the date, how to find it. And then you'll notice that in the shortened note, it has author's last name, comma, shortened title of the article, comma, page number. So the first time that you reference any source, you will include the full note. Any reference thereafter, you can use the shortened note. Sometimes some older, out-of-date Chicago styles will suggest that you use the Latin abbreviation IBID, I-B-I-D. IBID is kind of falling out of fashion because of modern word processors, because you can just kind of copy paste. In in the olden days when you had to use a typewriter and you used that really thin tissue paper on your typewriter, IBID was a way of getting around having to retype every note. But now that we have computer processing, computer word processing, IBID is kind of falling out of style. You won't get dinged if you use IBID, but it definitely shows that you don't know your style guide. Chicago style also has a bibliography, and of course, the bibliographical note is going to be different from the footnote citation, which is different from the short note citation. One of the biggest differences is going to be in the bibliographical note. It's organized last name, first name, and then organized in order of last name. In the full note, it's going to be first name, last name. Fiddly little things, but they're very, very important and just show that you know your stuff. On to MLA. MLA, of course, uses parenthetical in-text citation, usually last name, page number, and then you'll see the full citation in the bibliography. This is true of Chicago style as well. Your bibliography will have what they call a hanging indent. So notice that you have last name, first name, period, and then the rest of your citation. But the next line of your citation is scooted in more, and then the rest of the lines after that are in line. That's called a hanging indent. It's important, and it needs to be formatted correctly. So if you need help forming a hanging indent, talk to your teacher, talk to a librarian. I can show you how to do it on Microsoft Word if you want to send us an email at nhdaz at azhs.gov. But hanging indent, super, super important. It has to be formatted this way. I don't know why. These are just the rules. All right. Including and analyzing images. An image is worth 1,000 words, or is it? Images require just as much interpretation and analysis as documents. So you can't just add an image to your paper and think that your audience will agree with you as to why it matters. You have to explain it. And this is my favorite example of all time. This is an image from a collection that we have at the Historical Society that has to do with student protests in the 60s and 70s, primarily Mexican-American student protests. So this is a protest that happened at the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. And you can see all the students protesting. And you'll also see that in the foreground, there is this handwritten sign that says, warning, no dogs, golfers, or tourists allowed. And if you know your civil rights history, you know that this sign is a direct riff on Jim Crow era signage that would say something to the effect of, no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans. So what are they trying to tell us with this protest sign, and why does that matter for my project? That's the kind of stuff that you need to analyze in your paper, in addition to including the image. You have to explain to us why it's important and why it matters. All right, so weaving all of that stuff all together. Your thesis statement isn't just a one and done, it's the guiding light for your whole project. So you need to connect back to it. And so you will use your thesis statement to organize your project. And here's an example of how to do that, right? So in your introductory paragraph, you will have thing is thing because XYZ. That's your thesis statement. The next body paragraph will be about that first piece of evidence. It will be about evidence piece X, right? So your topic sentence is going to be a relationship between X and the two things that you mentioned in your thesis statement. And then you'll have a series of exhibits for that, right? You'll have exhibit A as to why you believe this relationship exists. And then the next sentence will be an explanation and analysis of exhibit A. And you will repeat that as necessary with exhibits B through Z if you need that many. And then, of course, you will have a conclusion that restates the relationship between X and the things in your thesis statement, and then you will move on to Y, and so on and so forth. So this is a skeleton of what your paper will look like. This is the 5-paragraph essay model. Some of us are beyond this, and if you're beyond this, fabulous. If you're still learning how to write, this is a good way to learn the rules before you can break them, right? So in your introduction, you will say something to the effect of, I will prove that thing is thing because X, Y, Z. And here is thing X, and here is exhibit A and why it matters, and here is exhibit B and why it matters. And I will conclude this section on X. And here is section Y. And here is exhibit C and why it matters, and exhibit D and why it matters, and so on and so forth until you get to your conclusion. And in your conclusion, you will say something to the effect of, see, now you agree that thing is thing because XYZ. Do not introduce new information in your conclusion. If you have new information to say, find somewhere to put it in your body paragraphs. Do not introduce new information in your conclusion. Your conclusion is really just tying all the things together, tying at the ends, putting a pretty bow on it, making sure that your reader, if they don't agree with you, at the very least, they can see where you're coming from. Yes, brevity is the soul of wit, of course, from our friend Bill Shakespeare. For many of us, 2,500 words is the longest thing we have ever written. And that is a huge accomplishment, and you should be really, really proud of that. But it's still really important to use those 2,500 words very, very, very wisely and edit for things like passive voice, redundancy, wordy sentences. It seems like a lot, but I know you have a lot to say. And so saying it as concisely as possible is going to be key to making sure you get all the things that you need to say in. So here's an example of passive voice. It took me a really long time to figure out the difference between active voice and passive voice. And both can be important, right? You can use passive voice on purpose, but it changes what the sentence does. So active voice is, of course, I kicked the ball. And then passive voice is the ball was kicked by me, is the implication. So you will find passive voice in situations where people are trying to obscure the actor, right? So you'll be reading a news article or a primary source, and it will say something like, the protesters were arrested by the police. So stuff like that is going to be everywhere in your primary sources, in your secondary sources too. Active voice just has less words in it. And so when you use active voice, you're not only using your words more wisely, you're making an assertion. And an assertion is key to that student voice component, key to making sure that your reader really, really knows that this piece was written by you and that you have something to say that is of value. So that's a little bit on passive voice. Redundancy and wordy sentences, you just want to make sure that you're reading for, am I using my words as clearly as possible so that I don't say things that just take up space, right? So here's a good example. Remove unnecessary words that you don't need in sentences. Well, unnecessary means things you don't need. So you don't need that part of the sentence. You can just say remove unnecessary words in sentences. It is really, really hard to do. And one of my favorite things when I'm proofing my project and I want to make sure that my project is super readable and makes sense is I am primarily a PC user, primarily a Microsoft Word user. And Microsoft Word has a function where it will read your paper back to you. Sometimes listening to it helps us pick up missing words or sentences that are clunky or like redundant sentences. So if you can have your computer or someone read your paper back to you, sometimes it's easier to hear than it is to read those changes because you know what you meant to say, but that's not what made it on the page. And then here's a quote from the Elements of Style. Vigorous writing is concise. A sentence should contain no unnecessary words, a paragraph no unnecessary sentences, for the same reason that a drawing should have no unnecessary lines and a machine should have no unnecessary parts. This requires not that the writer make all his sentences short, or that he avoid all detail and treats his subject only in outline, but that every word tell. So every word that you put on the page needs to be doing something. And if it's only doing part of its job or it's just kind of filler, maybe look into cutting it. Speaking of cuts, there is very famous writing advice, and it comes from Faulkner sometimes it's Ginsburg, sometimes it's someone else. But very famous writing advice that says, kill your darlings. A lot of people are opposed to kill your darlings because of the violent connotation therein. I say kill your darlings, or at least put it in a footnote. So if you are researching and you found something that is super, super cool, or you have found a new path, but you really want to work on what you have argued in your thesis statement, you should hang on to that information, but don't force it into your project. You can put it in a footnote if you really think it's vital to the project, or you can just kind of put it in a Word document and save it for later. So many historians that I know, when they were writing their dissertations, they were like, this is a really, really cool thing that I have found, but I just don't have time to cover it. But it'll be in the next book. That's what the next book is going to be about. You can always come back to it on your next project. And like I said, this is also a reminder, related, unrelated, to check your sources. Of course, kill your darlings is always attributed to William Faulkner, but it was said much, much earlier, like hundreds of years earlier, by this gentleman whose name I should have took note of and now is gone. All right, the TLDR of writing advice that I have for you. Just start writing. Just put pen to paper or start typing on a Word document. Pre-writing is really, really important, and you should do it. And I was a gifted and talented education student all through my public schooling as a child, and I hated pre-writing. I thought it was something that I didn't have to do because I was smart. And I didn't really understand the value of pre-writing because I was made to pre-write. So my campaign as an educator is that we don't call it pre-writing, we just call it writing, because it's part of the process. So you should really do it. Just scribble ideas, scribble an outline, because that'll be really important for you while you're forming your ideas and really thinking about what am I saying and how am I going to say it. The other thing is to make a point and to make it quickly. A reminder, this is not a report, this is an argument. You do need to have a point, and you need to make that point fairly quickly in the process of your paper or your project, whatever you decide to do, so that you can actually argue it. If you don't make a point quickly, you can't argue it, you can't conclude it, your reader won't agree with you. Always connect to the why. A lot of people say that they don't like history because they don't like memorizing things. And I don't like memorizing things either. I always tell people, if it's Googleable information, I don't know it off the top of my head. But what historians do that is really, really important is they think about why things matter and how things happen the way that they do. So why does it matter? Why should the reader care? All of that stuff is super, super important. Another piece of idea, or another piece of writing advice that I have for you is first idea, worst idea, which is not always the case, but it just rhymes. It goes together really well. So be willing to scrap an idea that doesn't work. If in order to support your idea, you find that you're cherry picking your research material or you're doing sloppy history, be ready to put that idea aside and go on to the next one. But on the other hand, do not throw anything away. Don't just kind of rip up your idea and put it in the trash can. Always start a new document so you can revisit an old idea in case you have a breakthrough, you figure out how to make it work. Finally, you are the expert historian. You can include the ideas of others. I encourage you to include the ideas of others, other experts in the field. But ultimately, at the end of the day, me and Kristen and the History Day judges at all levels, we want to know what you think as the expert. So don't hide behind expert opinion. Find a way to incorporate it while also asserting your own opinion. All right, if you need help, you can, of course, check out the Paper Hub on nhd.org. You can scan the code that I've included here. That'll take you right to the paper page. It's got student examples. It's got all kinds of things. Take the time to read that. Of course, you can email us at nhdaz, yeah, that's what it is, nhdaz@azhs.gov. It's easier to type than it is to say, with questions. I'm happy to answer your questions. We can connect you to, if I can't answer your question, we can find someone who can. Reach out to a teacher or a librarian. If you feel more comfortable talking to your history teacher or the librarian at your school, that's always a good place to start. All librarians get the same training. So even if, let's say you talk to Rachel and Perry here at the Historical Society, and you think to yourself, oh, well, they're not going to know about my topic because they're Arizona librarians and my topic's about Tahiti. They will know how to find what you need to find. And librarians make friends very easily, and they know someone who knows something. And then finally, make sure you pick up a book or a peer-reviewed article and really get a sense of, how is this laid out? How can I make my work similar to this work? And how can I convey the power of the history that I am interested in this media? All right. Like I said, contact us if you have any questions. Kristen, do you have any kind of end notes?
I think that was fabulous. As an English teacher, I was doing little happy dances when you would say certain things because I've read a lot of papers in my 30-something years of teaching, and you nailed it on the head. And I respect anyone that chooses the paper as their project.
Yeah, it is.
It's deep.
Seems like the low-hanging fruit because, oh, of course historians write papers. But it is really quite a challenge. And if you're getting ready to go to college, a lot of good colleges need a writing sample. You have your writing sample. Fabulous.
A winning writing sample.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fabulous. So thank you very much, Janie, and you'll be hearing more from her as she and I are moving forward on lessons. I think our next PD will be on performance. So looking forward to doing that in a couple weeks, and have a fabulous afternoon. And thank you so much for checking in.